I sat at the small kitchen table in my Rochester apartment. The winter light already fading, though it was barely late afternoon. The folder with all the receipts for the Hawaii trip lay open in front of me, flights to Maui, a week at the Lahaina beachfront hotel. Even snorkeling tours I thought Elise would love. It had taken months of overtime hours to cover it, but I told myself it would be worth every cent if it brought us together again. I dialed Elise's number with a kind of nervous excitement. I imagined hearing her voice bright with plans, maybe even a trace of gratitude. The phone rang twice. Then she answered. "Hi, honey," I said. "I can't wait to hear how the Hawaii planning is going. Did you talk to the hotel about check-in times?" There was a pause long enough for my chest to tighten. Then her tone came, flat and distant. "We already went last week, only for family." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, convinced I must have misheard, but Elise didn't repeat herself. She didn't soften the edge. She simply ended the call. I stayed there staring at the receipts, the numbers blurring. $22,000. I thought about the empty weekends, the skipped meals out, the second job I'd briefly taken just to make it possible. The betrayal cut deeper than my divorce ever had. At least in court, I knew what was being taken from me. This was theft, hidden under the word family. The apartment felt smaller than ever as silence closed in, and all I could hear was the echo of my daughter's voice. I opened the drawer where years of bank records lay, ready to confront the truth written in ink. The night after that call, I spread the papers across my dining table like a grim mosaic of my own choices. Each receipt carried a date, a memo line, and a piece of me I had willingly handed over. 2 years earlier, when the divorce papers were signed in Monroe County Court, I told myself I would rebuild by pouring into what remained constant, my family. The settlement left me weary, but I believed if I could hold everyone else together, I wouldn't fall apart. That belief guided every transfer I clicked submit on. I traced the numbers with my finger as if they might confess something new. $22,000 for the Hawaii trip airline tickets purchased months in advance. Resort deposit wired before Christmas. Tours booked as soon as Elise mentioned wanting to swim with manta rays. I had dreamed of standing beside her on that shore, a memory, to redeem all the years I had worked late instead of tucking her in. Then came the $50,000 more. Monthly rent payments sent directly to a landlord in Irondequoit so my parents could stay in their apartment when their pensions fell short. $800 here for Elise's car when the transmission failed. $500 there for emergency tuition fees she insisted had to be paid by midnight. Every sum felt like a thread weaving us together. Even as I unraveled, looking at the grand total $72,000, I felt something fracture inside. None of it had brought closeness. None of it had bought respect. I had mistaken duty for devotion, and they had let me believe money was the same as love. The receipts no longer looked like proof of sacrifice. They looked like a ledger of my erasure. I pushed the papers into a folder, my hands trembling, and realized this record was not just my past. It was a warning of what would come if I didn't stop. I leaned back, the folder heavy in my lap, and wondered how long I could go on funding affection that never arrived. After my marriage ended, Rochester's winters seemed longer than ever. The snow piled in gray ridges along East Avenue. The wind cut sharp across the Genesee, and I convinced myself that family would be the anchor to steady me through the cold. Every time the loneliness pressed in, I reminded myself that at least I still had them, Elise, my parents, the last circle that couldn't be broken, or so I thought. I gave up the little comforts that might have helped me heal. My therapist reminded me that rebuilding after divorce takes more than endurance. But when her invoice came, I told her I couldn't continue sessions. That money, I reasoned, belonged to my parents' overdue rent. A flyer for a weekend trip to Letchworth State Park sat on my desk for weeks before I threw it away. Instead, the funds went to Elise's textbooks. Even the thought of replacing my sagging couch was brushed aside when the car mechanic called about my daughter's transmission. Each sacrifice seemed harmless in isolation. Therapy could wait. Parks and furniture were luxuries. I told myself I was strong enough to weather my own storms if it meant shielding them from theirs. But the storms didn't pass. They gathered. Every month a new bill arrived. Every week a new request came through my phone, and I kept sending money, afraid that without me their lives would collapse. I thought my devotion was stitching us closer, but I see now it was only unspooling me. The anchor I trusted wasn't holding me steady. It was dragging me into waters I could barely tread. The Hawaii trip was not an exception, but the clearest sign of the pattern proof that no matter what I gave, they could cast me aside the moment it suited them. I closed the folder of receipts with a sharp snap, the sound echoing in the quiet apartment. The weight of it all pressed against my chest, but under that weight, something else stirred. Faint but steady. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I simply stopped. A month slipped by, but the sting of that phone call hadn't faded. I carried it with me into every quiet moment, the words replaying like a wound that refused to close. Then, on a gray Saturday afternoon, my phone lit up with Elise's name. Her voice was light at first, almost casual. "Mom, the landlord's on me again. Rent's overdue about $2,000 this time. Can you send it today?" I gripped the phone tighter, steadying my breath. A dozen old reflexes surged in me, the instinct to soothe, to solve, to wire the money before she even asked twice. For years, I'd responded without hesitation, believing it was my duty, my role as mother. But something inside me had shifted since Hawaii. I heard my own voice, sharper than I expected, only for family. Remember? There was a pause. I could almost hear her confusion hardening into disbelief. Before she could answer, I ended the call. My hand shook as I set the phone down. But the tremor wasn't from fear alone. It was the release of saying no after years of yes. The silence in the apartment felt charged, like a storm had passed through and left the air raw and open. I turned to my desk, pulled my laptop close, and logged into my KeyBank account. Automatic transfers blinked back at me. $200 for my parents' rent, $300 for Elise's car insurance, another $100 here and there for utilities. A lattice of withdrawals, quietly draining me each month. I dialed Janine Walsh, the advisor who had managed my accounts since the divorce. Her voice was steady, professional. "Marjorie, what can I do for you? I need to stop every single transfer. Rent, car, everything. Lock it down." There was no hesitation in her reply. "I'll walk you through it." Together we clicked through each line item, canceling one by one. With every confirmation screen, I felt lighter, though my hands trembled with the unfamiliar weight of reclaiming control. By the time we ended the call, my accounts were mine alone. I closed the laptop and sat back, breathing in the unfamiliar quiet, not knowing yet what storm would come to my door. The knock rattled the frame before I even reached the door. It was mid-morning, the light pale over Park Avenue, and I still hadn't finished my first cup of coffee. Through the peephole, I saw them Elise, arms crossed and jaw set. My parents stiff and unsmiling, and a man in a dark suit gripping a briefcase like a weapon. I cracked the door an inch. Elise didn't waste a second. "Mom, this is Thomas Hayes, our attorney. We need to talk about your financial obligations. You can't just cut us off." The word obligations stung more than I expected. My mother leaned in, her voice clipped. "Marjorie, you've always been the responsible one. Don't start shirking now. Family depends on you. behind her. My father shifted from foot to foot, eyes on the floor as though he knew the script but couldn't summon conviction. Hayes cleared his throat and spoke with practiced detachment. Your family is concerned. They report sudden and erratic decisions that place them at risk. We'd prefer to resolve this without escalation. I felt something tighten inside me, like a rope pulled too far. Elise's voice rose above the lawyer's measured tone. You're being selfish. You've always helped us. Why stop now because of some grudge, because you want to punish us? I opened the door wider, just enough to meet her eyes. Selfish? I've carried you all for years, paid your rent, covered emergencies, scraped by while you treated my sacrifices as nothing. And when I gave you the chance of a lifetime, you shut me out as if I wasn't even family. Don't stand here pretending I owe you more. For a moment, Elise faltered, her mouth opening without words. Hayes tried to interject, but I'd had enough. I closed the door hard, the echo running through the apartment like a gavel. Their voices rose on the other side, pleading, demanding, accusing, but I slid the bolt and turned away. I dialed a locksmith before the adrenaline left my body. By early afternoon, the old locks were gone, replaced with heavy brass deadbolts. A technician mounted a small camera above the door, showing me how to track every movement from my phone. When the new key turned smooth in the lock, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in years, the barrier between my life and theirs felt solid. Yet as I held the key in my palm, I knew this battle was only beginning, and the next move would not come at my choosing. 2 nights after the confrontation, I walked through the glass doors of the Rochester Central Library, my steps heavy but deliberate. The book club met on the 2nd floor, and though the novel of the month sat unopened in my bag, I needed to be among people who saw me as more than a bank account. The room was warm, lined with tall windows that caught the last traces of daylight. Familiar faces greeted me, Martha with her quick smile, Evelyn with her soft nod, but it was Clara Jennings who caught my eye. She had a way of looking past the surface, straight into the marrow of things. You've got a storm on your face, she murmured when I sat down beside her. The discussion about the book carried on around us, but Clara leaned closer. The words tumbled out of me, Elise's call, the rent demand, the cruel phrase only for family, and the knock on my door with Hayes and my parents standing shoulder to shoulder. I expected shame to choke me, but the sentences flowed like water breaking through a dam. Clara listened without flinching. When I finished, she exhaled slowly, her eyes steady on mine. Marjorie, I know exactly where you are. My brother drained me for nearly a decade. Rent, car repairs, medical bills he swore were urgent. I thought each payment would buy me peace, or at least closeness. All it bought was silence until the next demand. Her voice carried no bitterness, only a hard-won clarity. She told me about the night she finally refused him, the way he accused her of cruelty, how he dragged her name through their family before fading into distance. It nearly broke me, she admitted, but it also saved me. Her words sank into me, heavier than the receipts stacked on my desk. I wasn't an anomaly. I wasn't unstable. I was standing in the same current that had pulled others under. Clara reached into her tote and slid a card into my hand. Robert Lawson, she said, estate attorney here in Rochester. He's sharp and unshakable. When my brother tried to push further, Robert cut through the noise. You need someone like him before they escalate again. I turned the card over, the print crisp and solid. Something in me shifted as I held it. For weeks, my world had narrowed to accusations and defenses, to a daughter who treated me like a ledger. Now, with Clara's voice anchoring me, the horizon widened again. You've been their lifeline, she said, her hand brushing mine. But no one can breathe if they're always underwater. It's time you came up for air. I tucked the card into my wallet. its edge pressing against my palm like proof. That night, walking back through the library's glass doors into the cool Rochester air, I felt the first stirrings of a plan. The fight wasn't over, but I wouldn't face it alone. The knock this time was quieter, but no less unnerving. A woman stood at my door in a gray coat, clipboard in hand, her badge catching the light. She introduced herself as a social worker from Monroe County. Elise, she explained, had filed a report claiming I was acting erratically with money and jeopardizing the family's stability. For a moment, anger threatened to rise, but I steadied my voice and invited her in. I had been expecting something like this ever since Hayes showed up. I pulled a folder from my desk, already prepared after Clara's warning. Inside were 10 years of performance reviews from my firm, each one marking promotions and commendations. I laid out pay stubs showing steady income, bank statements that reflected regular deposits, and account balances that were far from the picture of chaos Elise had painted. The social worker flipped through the pages, her pen tapping against the edge of her clipboard. I dialed Robert Lawson right there on speaker. "Mr. Lawson," I said evenly. "A social worker is here about a report. Can you advise?" His voice came calm and precise. "Provide documentation. Answer questions clearly, and I'll follow up formally. This is harassment by proxy. You're handling it right." I turned back to the visitor and gave her everything she asked for. She took notes, her expression softening as the weight of proof grew heavier than the accusation. A week later, she scheduled an evaluation with Dr. Sarah Klein, a psychiatrist. I sat through questions about my routines, my decisions, my recent choices. When it ended, Dr. Klein leaned back, her tone measured but firm. "You're competent, deliberate, and careful. What you've done is not impulsive, it's protective." Her words landed like a verdict of their own, one I needed more than I'd realized. I left her office with the report in my bag and a new steadiness in my step, knowing the fight ahead would only grow sharper. The courthouse in downtown Rochester felt colder than the February air outside. I sat beside Robert Lawson at the long wooden table, the folder of evidence heavy in my lap. Across from us, Elise and my parents whispered with their attorney, Thomas Hayes. They avoided my eyes, but I felt the weight of their intent pressing toward me. Hayes began with smooth words, arguing I had grown unstable, that my sudden withdrawal of support left my family in hardship. Elise took the stand first, her voice trembling on cue. She just changed overnight. She said, "We don't know what's wrong with her. She shut us out without reason." My father followed, his tone gruff. "She isn't herself anymore. We only want to protect her." Their words stung, but Robert leaned forward, steady as stone. When Hayes called on neighbors and acquaintances to paint me reckless, Robert objected each time, stripping away hearsay until the testimony collapsed under its own weakness. Then Dr. Sarah Klein spoke. Clear, measured, unwavering. "Ms. Ellison is fully competent. Her financial decisions are consistent with rational boundary setting. There is no evidence of instability." When it was my turn, I rose, my palms damp but my voice even. I looked directly at Judge Carter. For years I carried their burdens. I paid their bills, covered their emergencies, gave more than I could afford. And when I set a boundary, they called it cruelty. But setting boundaries isn't cruelty. It's survival. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Judge Carter's pen scratched across his notes. Then he looked up. "The plaintiffs have not provided credible evidence of incapacity. The case is dismissed." Relief broke through me like light through ice. But as I stepped out of the courtroom, I knew the verdict was only one part of my freedom. By spring, the snow had melted from the rooftops, and I was settling into my new apartment overlooking the Genesee. The windows faced west, catching the glow of the sunset as it slipped behind the skyline. For the first time in years, the view felt like mine, unburdened by the weight of who might come knocking. I filled the rooms slowly, not with expensive things, but with choices I had made for myself. A second-hand bookshelf from a shop on Monroe Avenue, a few plants that leaned eagerly toward the light, a sturdy kitchen table where bills no longer piled higher than meals. The silence in these rooms was not empty, it was clean. One evening, I signed up for a cooking class at the community center. I laughed out loud when my first attempt at rolling pasta dough came out lumpy, flour dusting my hands like chalk. "You're getting there," the instructor said, and I believed her. Each week I grew steadier, sauce simmering on the stove, knives moving with rhythm, the satisfaction of tasting something created only for me. Travel brochures spread across the table soon followed. Italy's Amalfi Coast called to me with its cliffs and blue waters. The trails of Acadia in Maine promised quiet strength. I circled places, penciled notes in the margins, imagining a life shaped not by obligation, but by wonder. News trickled back through neighbors and old acquaintances. Elise had moved in with my parents in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city. She was juggling 2 jobs: cashier by day, waitress by night. My parents leaned on her now, the same way they had leaned on me. A pang of memory struck, but it passed quickly. I did not wish them harm. I simply knew it was no longer my duty to bankroll their survival. One evening, I stood at the window, the city lights flickering like a scattered constellation. The river moved steady and sure beneath me, carrying winter away toward the lake. I held a glass of wine in my hand and realized I had finally stepped into a life that was mine, and mine alone.